The letter trembled in Georgia Hartford's hands as the stagecoach lurched over another rut in the Colorado road, and she wondered if her mother had known how impossible this final request would be. 3 days had passed since Mama had drawn her last rattling breath in that cramped boarding house room in Denver, and Georgia still felt the weight of those final whispered words pressing against her chest like a stone. "Find the mountains where your father proposed," her mother had said, clutching Georgia's hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "The place with the 3 peaks that look like cathedral spires. Scatter my ashes there, Georgie. Let me rest where I was happiest." The problem was that Georgia had no idea where those mountains were. Her father had died when she was only 2 years old, back in 1862 during the war, and her mother had rarely spoken of their brief time together out west. Now it was 1885, and Georgia found herself at 23 years old, alone in a territory she barely knew, with a small wooden box containing her mother's ashes and nothing but a faded photograph showing 3 distinctive peaks in the distance. The stagecoach driver had suggested she try Greeley, Colorado, said there were plenty of old-timers there who might recognize the landmarks. So here she sat, her black morning dress already covered in dust, heading toward a town she had never seen, hoping against hope that someone could help her honor her mother's final wish. The buildings of Greeley appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Georgia pressed her face to the window, studying the peaks in the distance, but there were so many of them, all jumbled together in a confusion of stone and snow. How was she supposed to find 3 specific mountains in all of that wilderness? The stagecoach rolled to a stop outside the depot, and Georgia gathered her small carpet bag and the wooden box, holding the latter close to her chest as she stepped down into the dusty street. The town bustled with activity despite the late hour. Cowboys rode past on horseback, their spurs jingling. Wagons loaded with supplies creaked along the main road. Women in calico dresses hurried along the wooden sidewalks, and men in work clothes emerged from various shops and businesses. Georgia stood there for a moment, feeling overwhelmed and very much alone. She had precisely $43 to her name, the remainder of what her mother had saved over the years working as a seamstress. It would have to be enough to see this through. "You need help finding somewhere, miss." The stagecoach driver appeared beside her, holding another passenger's trunk. "I need to find someone who knows the mountains," Georgia said, her voice barely steady. "Someone who has been here a long time and might recognize a specific place from a photograph." The driver scratched his gray beard, thinking, "Well, you might try Samuel Bradford. He owns the biggest ranch outside of town, been here since before the town was even founded. If anyone knows every peak and valley in these parts, it would be him." He pointed down the main street. "His foreman usually comes into the Mercantile on Saturday afternoons. That is where you will find someone who can point you toward the ranch." Georgia thanked him and made her way down the street, her boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk. The Mercantile was easy to find, a large building with windows displaying everything from farming equipment to bolts of fabric. She pushed through the door, and a bell chimed overhead. The proprietor, a round man with kind eyes, looked up from behind the counter. "Good afternoon, miss. What can I help you find?" "I am looking for someone from the Bradford Ranch," Georgia said. "The stagecoach driver said I might find them here." "You are in luck. Tucker rode in about 20 minutes ago. He is loading supplies out back." The proprietor gestured toward a door at the rear of the store. "You can go on through." Georgia walked through the crowded store, past barrels of flour and sugar, past shelves lined with canned goods and tools, and out into the dusty yard behind the building. A wagon stood there, and a weathered man in his 50s was hoisting sacks of grain into the bed. "Excuse me, are you from the Bradford ranch?" Georgia asked. The man turned, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yes, madam. Tucker Hayes, foreman. What can I do for you?" Georgia explained her situation as concisely as she could, watching his expression shift from curiosity to sympathy as she told him about her mother's death and her final wish. "I have a photograph," she said, pulling the worn image from her bag. "It shows 3 peaks that look like cathedral spires. My father took my mother there to propose, somewhere in these mountains. I need to find that exact spot." Tucker studied the photograph, his brow furrowed. "This is old. Must be more than 20 years. 23 years, Georgia confirmed. "I know it is a long time, but the mountains do not change, do they?" "No, madam, they do not." Tucker looked at the image more closely, tilting it to catch the fading light. "You know, these peaks look familiar, but I cannot say for certain. Mr. Bradford would know for sure. He has explored every inch of this territory, done survey work for the railroad and the mining companies. If anyone can identify this spot, it would be him." Hope flickered in George's chest for the first time since leaving Denver. "Would he be willing to see me?" "I know I am a stranger, but this is terribly important." Tucker smiled, his weathered face creasing into kind lines. "Mr. Bradford is not the sort to turn away someone in need. Tell you what, I am heading back to the ranch now. You can ride along if you do not mind sitting on a grain sack." "I would not mind at all," Georgia said quickly. "Thank you. Thank you so much." The ride out to the Bradford ranch took about 40 minutes, following a well-worn road that led west from town toward the foothills. Tucker kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling Georgia about the ranch and its owner. Samuel Bradford had come to Colorado in 1858, Tucker explained, back when it was still Kansas territory. He had started with nothing but a good horse and a lot of determination, built his ranch up from a small homestead to one of the largest cattle operations in Weld County. "He is a fair man," Tucker said. "Works as hard as any of the hands. Lost his wife about 8 years back to fever. Has not been quite the same since, if I am honest. Keeps to himself more than he used to, but he will help you if he can. That is just his nature." The ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, and Georgia found herself impressed by the spread before her. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built of stone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Barns and outbuildings dotted the property, all well maintained. Cattle grazed in vast pastures that stretched toward the mountains, and she could see several cowboys working near the corrals. Tucker pulled the wagon up to the main house and helped Georgia down. "Wait here on the porch. I will let Mr. Bradford know you have come to see him." Georgia stood on the porch, clutching her carpetbag and the wooden box, trying to calm her nervous heart. She had not expected to feel so anxious, but something about this place, about the hope that this stranger might be able to help her, made her hands shake slightly. The door opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch, and Georgia felt her breath catch in her throat. Samuel Bradford was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his work shirt. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his face was tanned from years in the sun, with strong features and intelligent blue eyes. He looked to be in his late 30s, maybe 40, and there was a quiet strength about him that was immediately apparent. "Miss Hartford." His voice was deep and warm. "Tucker tells me you need help finding a place in the mountains." Georgia found her voice with some effort. "Yes, sir. I am sorry to impose on you, but I was told you might be able to identify a location from an old photograph." She held out the image with slightly trembling hands. "My mother passed away 3 days ago in Denver. Her last wish was to have her ashes scattered in a specific place in these mountains, where my father proposed to her 23 years ago. I have no idea where it is, only this photograph. Samuel took the picture carefully, as though he understood how precious it was. He studied it in the fading light, his expression serious and focused. Georgia watched his face, trying to read his reaction, hope and fear warring in her chest. After what felt like an eternity, Samuel looked up, and something in his expression made Georgia's heart leap. "I know this place," he said quietly. "These three peaks, the way they align just so. This is about 15 miles northwest of here, up in the high country. There is a meadow beneath them, fed by a spring. It is one of the most beautiful spots in Colorado." Relief flooded through Georgia so powerfully that she felt her knees go weak. She pressed one hand against the porch railing to steady herself. "You can take me there." "I can," Samuel said. "But it is not an easy journey. The terrain is rough and we would need to go on horseback. It would take the better part of a day to get there and back." He paused, studying her face with those perceptive blue eyes. "When did you last eat?" The question caught Georgia off guard. I had something this morning at the boarding house in Denver." "That was many hours ago. Come inside. You will have supper with me and we will make plans for tomorrow. You can stay here tonight. I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who keeps several guest rooms ready." "I could not possibly impose," Georgia started to protest, but Samuel shook his head. "It is not an imposition. You are exhausted and grieving and you need rest before we attempt the journey. Besides, we should leave at first light to have enough daylight for the trip. It only makes sense for you to stay here tonight." His logic was sound, and Georgia was too tired to argue. She nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Bradford. You are very kind." "Samuel," he corrected gently. "Please call me Samuel." He led her into the house, and Georgia found herself in a comfortable home that spoke of a man who valued quality but not ostentation. The furniture was solid and well made, the floors polished wood, the walls decorated with paintings of Western landscapes. It was a masculine space but not unwelcoming. A small Chinese woman appeared from what must be the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Samuel, we have guests." "This is Miss Georgia Hartford," Samuel said. "She will be staying the night and needs a room prepared. And we will have supper in about half an hour if that suits." Mrs. Chen smiled warmly at Georgia. Of course. Come, miss. I show you to room, you wash up before eating." Georgia followed the housekeeper upstairs where Mrs. Chen led her to a pleasant room with a large bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. "You rest a few minutes," Mrs. Chen said kindly. "I bring hot water for washing. Supper will be ready soon." Left alone, Georgia sank down onto the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of the past few days. Her mother was gone. That reality hit her again, as it had been hitting her at unexpected moments since she had watched them place her mother's body in the undertaker's wagon. But at least now, there was hope that she could fulfill her mother's final wish. That had to be enough to keep her going. True to her word, Mrs. Chen returned with hot water, and Georgia washed the dust from her face and hands, changed into a clean shirtwaist, and brushed out her dark hair before pinning it back up. When she came downstairs, she found Samuel standing in what appeared to be a study, looking at papers on a large desk. He looked up as she approached, feeling better. "Yes, thank you, your home is lovely." "It is comfortable," Samuel said. "That is all I need." He gestured for her to follow him to the dining room where Mrs. Chen had laid out a simple but substantial meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread. They sat down at the polished table, And Georgia realized this was the first proper meal she had eaten since before her mother had taken her final turn for the worse. She had been living on fear and grief for days, barely able to force down food. "Tell me about your mother," Samuel said after they had eaten in silence for a few minutes. "If you do not mind speaking of her." Georgia looked up, surprised by the request, but something in Samuel's face told her the question came from genuine interest, not mere politeness. "She was a seamstress," Georgia said. "One of the best in Boston, where we lived most of my life. She could look at a dress in a magazine and recreate it perfectly, make it fit like it was made specifically for the woman wearing it. People came from all over the city to have her make their clothes. But you came from Colorado originally." "My father did. Jonathan Hartford. He was a surveyor. My mother met him when he came to Boston on business in 1861. She said he swept her off her feet, convinced her to come west with him even though she had never left Massachusetts before. They married and came out here, and I was born in 1862. But my father died that same year. Fever, my mother said. She was devastated. She took me back to Boston to be near her family, and we stayed there until now." "Why did she want to come back here to rest?" Samuel asked gently. "She said the brief time she had with my father here in Colorado was the happiest of her life," Georgia said, her voice catching slightly. "Even though it was so short, even though she lost him so quickly. She said there was something about this place, about the mountains and the open sky, that made her feel truly alive. She wanted to return to that feeling, to be where they were happiest together." Samuel was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a depth of understanding that told Georgia he knew something about loss. "Love like that leaves a mark on a place. It makes sense she would want to return to it." "You lost your wife," Georgia said softly. "Tucker mentioned it." "I am sorry." 8 years ago," Samuel confirmed. "Catherine, she was everything good in my life. When she died, I thought I would never feel whole again." He met Georgia's eyes across the table. "But time does something strange. It does not heal exactly, but it changes the shape of the grief until you can carry it. Your mother's ashes will rest in a beautiful place. That is a gift you are giving her." They finished the meal talking of easier things. Samuel told her about the ranch, about the challenges of raising cattle in Colorado's variable climate. Georgia found herself relaxing for the first time in days, drawn in by Samuel's calm presence and the genuine interest he showed in her responses. After supper, Mrs. Chen served coffee in the living room, and Samuel spread a detailed map on the low table between their chairs. "This is where we are going tomorrow," he said, pointing to a spot on the map. "The terrain is rough but manageable. We will follow an old mining trail for most of the way." "Have you ridden much?" "Not in years," Georgia admitted. "My mother and I lived in the city." "I will give you one of my gentler horses," Samuel said. "Marigold is steady and sure-footed. She will take good care of you. You should wear practical clothes if you have them. It will be a long ride." Georgia thought of the limited contents of her carpet bag. "I have a split skirt that I wore sometimes for walking in the country. Will that do?" "That should work. And I will have Mrs. Chen pack food and water for the journey." Samuel looked at Georgia, his expression serious. "I want you to understand this will not be an easy trip. The altitude alone can be difficult if you are not accustomed to it. If at any point you need to stop and rest, you tell me. There is no shame in taking your time." "I understand," Georgia said. "And Samuel, I cannot thank you enough for doing this. You do not even know me, yet you are giving up your entire day to help me." "Some things matter more than a day's work," Samuel said simply. "Your mother's final wish is one of those things. Besides," he added with a small smile that transformed his serious face, "I do not get up into that high country as often as I used to. It will be good to see it again." That night, lying in the comfortable bed in Samuel's guest room, Georgia found herself thinking not just about her mother, but about the man who had so quickly and generously offered to help her. There was something about Samuel Bradford that drew her, something beyond his obvious physical appeal. He had a quiet strength, a steadiness that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her mother had first fallen ill. She drifted off to sleep thinking about the journey ahead, hoping that tomorrow she would finally be able to grant her mother's last wish. Dawn came early, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Georgia woke to the sound of activity outside, the low voices of ranch hands beginning their day's work. She dressed quickly in her split skirt and a practical shirtwaist, braided her long dark hair to keep it out of her way, and went downstairs to find Samuel already up, dressed in work clothes and boots, checking supplies piled on the kitchen table. "Good morning," he said, his eyes taking in her practical outfit with approval. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in weeks," Georgia admitted. "Your home is very peaceful." Mrs. Chen bustled in with a plate of eggs and toast. "You eat good breakfast. Long ride today. Need strength." Georgia ate obediently while Samuel finished organizing their supplies. In addition to food and water, he packed a bedroll, matches, a small medical kit, and a rifle, which he must have seen concerned her because he said, "Just a precaution. We will not need it, but I never go into the backcountry without one. Mountain lions and bears, mostly. They leave you alone if you leave them alone, but better to be prepared." After breakfast, they walked out to the barn, where Tucker had already saddled 2 horses. The first was a magnificent bay gelding, tall and powerful. The second was a smaller Palomino mare with a sweet face and gentle eyes. "This is Marigold," Samuel said, leading Georgia to the mare. "She is as calm as they come. She will follow Thunder, my horse, and you will not have to do much except stay in the saddle and enjoy the ride." Samuel helped Georgia mount, his hands steadying her as she settled into the saddle. His touch was brief and completely proper, but Georgia found herself very aware of his strength, of the warmth of his hands through her sleeve. She pushed the feeling aside, focusing on adjusting her seat and finding the stirrups. "Comfortable?" Samuel asked, looking up at her with those penetrating blue eyes. "As comfortable as someone who has not ridden in 5 years can be," Georgia said with a nervous laugh. Samuel mounted his own horse with easy grace, the movement speaking of decades in the saddle. He leaned over and adjusted Georgia's reins slightly, showing her the proper hold. "Just keep light contact with her mouth. She will follow Thunder. If you need to stop, just say so. We are not in a race." They set off as the sun cleared the horizon, riding west toward the mountains. The morning air was cool and clean, scented with sage and pine. As they left the ranch behind, the landscape began to change, the flat pasturelands giving way to rolling hills covered in scrub and wildflowers. Samuel kept a moderate pace, frequently looking back to check on Georgia. At first she felt awkward and stiff in the saddle, her body remembering why she had not missed riding. But gradually, as the miles passed, she began to relax into Marigold's steady rhythm, letting her body move with the horse rather than against it. "You are doing well," Samuel called back to her. "Natural seat." "I do not feel very natural," Georgia said, but she smiled, pleased by the compliment. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the terrain grew rockier and the vegetation thicker. They followed a narrow trail that wound between boulders and stands of pine and aspen. The aspens were just beginning to turn, their leaves shimmering gold in the morning light. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and Georgia found herself understanding a little more why her mother had loved this place. They stopped around mid-morning beside a small creek to water the horses and rest. Samuel helped Georgia dismount, and she was grateful for his steadying hand. Her legs felt like jelly after several hours in the saddle. "We are making good time," Samuel said, pulling out canteens and offering her one. "Another few hours and we will be there." Georgia drank deeply, the cold water refreshing after the dusty ride. "It is so beautiful here, so wild and open. Boston feels like another world." "It is another world," Samuel said. "Out here, you are reminded how small you are, how big everything else is. It can be humbling. It can also be freeing." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you think you will go back to Boston after this?" The question caught Georgia unprepared. She had not thought beyond fulfilling her mother's wish, had not let herself think about what came after. "I suppose I will have to," she said slowly. "My mother's apartment, her belongings, her business, it all needs to be settled. But after that," she shook her head, "I do not know. There is nothing really tying me there anymore. My mother's family passed years ago. I have no siblings, no husband. I know her trade, seamstressing, but I never loved it the way she did." "What do you love?" Samuel asked. The question was so direct, so genuinely interested that Georgia found herself answering honestly. "I love being outdoors. I love plants and growing things. When I was a girl, I used to help tend a small garden behind our apartment building, and I was always happiest there, with dirt on my hands and the sun on my face. But that is not exactly a profession, is it? Not for a woman alone in the world." "It could be," Samuel said. "Out here, people make their own way. If you have skills and determination, you can build a life around what you love." He paused, then added, "For what it is worth, you do not strike me as a woman who belongs in a cramped city apartment." Something in his tone made Georgia look at him more closely, but his expression was unreadable as he gathered up the canteens and prepared to mount up again. They rode on, climbing steadily higher, and Georgia found herself thinking about his words. Could she really start over out here? Build a new life in this wild, beautiful place? The sun was high overhead when Samuel finally pulled up his horse and pointed ahead. "There," he said. "Do you see?" Georgia looked where he was pointing, and her breath caught. 3 peaks rose against the blue sky, their shapes so distinctive there could be no doubt. They looked exactly like cathedral spires, just as her mother had described, tall and narrow and majestic. Below them spread a meadow, green and lush, dotted with late summer wildflowers in purple and yellow and white. "That is it," Georgia whispered. "That is the place." They rode down into the meadow, and it was like entering another world. The grass grew thick and soft, fed by a spring that bubbled up from between rocks at the far end. The sound of water was musical, peaceful. Birds sang in the pine trees that ringed the meadow, and the 3 peaks stood sentinel overhead, their presence both powerful and comforting. Samuel dismounted and helped Georgia down. Her legs were shaky, but she barely noticed. She was too focused on the beauty of this place, trying to imagine her parents here 23 years ago, young and in love, her father proposing to her mother in this perfect spot. "Thank you," she said to Samuel, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing me here." "Take your time," Samuel said gently. "I will tend to the horses. You do what you came to do." Georgia pulled the wooden box from her saddlebag, holding it close to her chest for a moment. Then she walked into the center of the meadow, toward the spring, toward the place where the view of the 3 peaks was most perfect. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the sun warm on her face, the breeze soft against her skin, listening to the water and the birds and the profound silence beneath it all. She could feel why her mother had loved this place. There was a peace here, a rightness that spoke to something deep in the soul. "Mama," Georgia said softly, opening the box, "I brought you home, back to where you were happiest, back to Papa. Rest now. Rest with the memory of the love you shared." She scattered the ashes slowly, reverently, watching them drift on the breeze across the meadow, catching the sunlight as they fell to earth. Some scattered into the spring, becoming one with the water. Some settled among the wildflowers. Some drifted toward the pine trees. And when the box was empty, Georgia felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief she had been carrying. She stood there for a long time, just being present in this place, saying a silent goodbye to the woman who had raised her, loved her, shaped her into who she was. When she finally turned back toward where Samuel waited with the horses, she found him a respectful distance away, giving her privacy. But his eyes were on her with such understanding and compassion that she felt tears spill over onto her cheeks. She walked to him, and without thinking, without planning, she stepped into his arms. Samuel held her gently as she cried, one large hand stroking her back in soothing circles, not saying anything, just being solid and present and kind. Georgia let herself lean into his strength, let herself grieve fully for the first time since her mother had died. When her tears finally subsided, she pulled back, embarrassed. "I am sorry. I did not mean to fall apart on you." "You do not need to apologize," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Grief needs to come out. Better here than holding it in until it poisons you." He reached up and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, the gesture so tender it made her heart ache. They stood there for a moment, very close, and Georgia found herself looking into Samuel's eyes and seeing something there that made her breath catch. Something warm and wondering and new. She felt it too, this pull between them, this connection that seemed to have formed impossibly quickly. Samuel cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the moment. "We should eat something. Rest before the ride back." They sat in the meadow and ate the lunch Mrs. Chen had packed, cold chicken and bread and apples. They talked quietly, sharing stories. Samuel told her about building the ranch, about the early days when it was just him and a few head of cattle. Georgia told him about growing up in Boston, about her mother's strength and determination, about the little joys they had found in their simple life. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Samuel said. "She was. She taught me that love is the only thing that really matters, that you can lose everything else, but if you had love, even for a brief time, it was worth it." Georgia looked at the three peaks, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. "She only had 2 years with my father, but she said they were the best years of her life. She never remarried, never even looked at another man. She said some people only get one great love, and she had hers." "You believe that?" Samuel asked. "That people only get one great love?" Georgia considered the question. "I used to think so, but lately I wonder if maybe we can be blessed more than once if we are brave enough to open our hearts again." She looked at Samuel. "You loved your wife deeply. Do you think you could love again?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "I thought I could not. When Catherine died, I felt like part of me died with her. I went through the motions of living, but I was not really alive, just existing. But lately," he paused, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, "I have started to wonder if maybe I was wrong, if maybe the heart has more capacity than we think." The air between them seemed charged with possibility, with things unsaid but deeply felt. Georgia knew she should look away, should not let herself feel what she was feeling for this man she had only met yesterday. But something about Samuel, about his kindness and strength, and the way he looked at her like she mattered, like she was worth paying attention to, made her want to be brave. "We should head back," Samuel said, though he did not sound like he wanted to. "It will take us several hours to get home, and we do not want to be on the trail after dark." They packed up and mounted the horses, and Georgia took one last long look at the meadow, at the 3 cathedral peaks standing watch over this sacred place. She felt at peace knowing her mother's ashes were here, that she had fulfilled her promise. But she also felt something else, something unexpected. She felt hope. Hope for her own future, for possibilities she had not dared to imagine before. The ride back was quieter than the ride up had been. Both of them seemed lost in their own thoughts, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. There was an easiness between them now, a connection that had formed through shared experience and honest conversation. As they descended from the high country back into the foothills, the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Samuel pointed out a herd of elk grazing on a distant hillside, and they stopped to watch the animals for a few minutes, marveling at their grace and power. "I never see things like this in Boston," Georgia said. "The wildness of it all, it makes me feel alive." "That is what the West does," Samuel said. "It reminds you that you are alive, forces you to be present, to pay attention. That is what I have always loved about it." They reached the ranch just as full darkness fell. Tucker appeared to take the horses, and Mrs. Chen had supper waiting. Georgia was exhausted, sore in muscles she had forgotten she had, but also strangely energized. The day had been physically demanding but emotionally cathartic. She felt lighter than she had in months. Over supper, Samuel asked her about her plans. "Will you return to Denver tomorrow? Or do you need more time before heading back east?" Georgia found herself hesitating. She had planned to take the stage back to Denver the next day to begin the process of settling her mother's affairs and returning to Boston. But suddenly, that plan felt wrong, premature. "I am not sure," she said honestly. "I suppose I should go back, but I find I am not ready. Is there a hotel in Greeley where I could stay for a few days? I would like some time to think, to decide what comes next." "There is a hotel, but you are welcome to stay here," Samuel said. "I have the room, and Mrs. Chen enjoys the company. You could rest, recover from the journey, think about things without the pressure of staying in a strange hotel." "I could not impose on your hospitality any longer," Georgia protested, though part of her desperately wanted to accept his offer. "It is not an imposition," Samuel said firmly. "Georgia, I want you to stay, at least for a few more days. You have been through an ordeal and you need time to recover, to grieve, to figure out what you want to do next. Let me help with that, please." The sincerity in his voice, the genuine care in his eyes broke down her resistance. "If you are sure it is not too much trouble, then yes, thank you. I would like to stay." The next few days fell into a gentle rhythm. Georgia slept late, exhausted from grief and travel. She took walks around the ranch, exploring the barns and outbuildings, meeting the ranch hands and learning about the work of running a cattle operation. Samuel gave her space, but was always nearby if she wanted company, and they fell into the habit of having long conversations over meals, or while sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the sun set over the mountains. Georgia learned that Samuel was 38 years old, had been born in Missouri, and had come west as a young man seeking adventure and opportunity. He had worked as everything from a cowboy to a railroad surveyor before staking his claim and building his ranch. He read voraciously, his study lined with books on subjects ranging from animal husbandry to philosophy. He was thoughtful and intelligent, with a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. For his part, Samuel seemed genuinely interested in Georgia's life, her experiences, her thoughts and opinions. He asked her about books she had read, about what she thought of various political issues, about her dreams and fears. He treated her as an equal, as someone worth listening to, and Georgia found herself blossoming under that kind of respectful attention. On the third day of her extended stay, Samuel found her in the kitchen garden behind the house, where Mrs. Chen grew vegetables and herbs. Georgia was kneeling in the dirt, examining the plants with obvious fascination. "You really do love growing things," Samuel observed, leaning against the fence and watching her. Georgia looked up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "I do, Mrs. Chen was telling me about her methods, how she has adapted Chinese gardening techniques to Colorado's climate. It is fascinating. Look at this squash plant, how healthy it is. She has been feeding it with composted manure and coffee grounds." Samuel smiled, something warm and fond in his expression. "I have an idea if you are interested." "What kind of idea? Come with me." He led her around to the side of the house, to a plot of land about 30 feet square that was currently overgrown with weeds. "This was Catherine's garden," Samuel said, his voice going quiet. "She loved flowers, spent hours out here every day tending them. After she died, I could not bring myself to keep it up. Eventually, it just went to weeds." "Oh, Samuel," Georgia said softly, understanding the pain that memory must carry. "I have been thinking," Samuel continued, "that maybe it is time to bring this plot back to life. Not as it was, but as something new. And I thought if you are interested, maybe you could help. Plan it out, decide what to plant. We could work on it together." Georgia felt her heart swell with emotion. This was not just about a garden. This was Samuel trusting her with something precious, inviting her into a wounded part of his life and asking her to help heal it. "I would be honored," she said. "But Samuel, are you sure? This is your wife's garden." "I do not want to intrude on that memory." "You would not be intruding," Samuel said, meeting her eyes. "Catherine loved life and growth and beauty. She would not want this space to stay dead and neglected. She would want it to bloom again. And I think," he paused, his voice going rough with emotion, "I think she would like you. I think she would be glad it was you helping me bring it back to life." Over the following days, they worked on the garden together. Samuel cleared the weeds and turned over the soil while Georgia planned what to plant. It was too late in the season for most flowers, but Mrs. Chen had seedlings of cold, hardy plants that would survive the first frosts, and Georgia designed a layout that would come fully into bloom the following spring. Working beside Samuel in the warm autumn sun, their hands in the dirt, talking and laughing and occasionally falling into comfortable silence, Georgia felt something shift in her heart. She was falling in love with this man. It was different from the girlish fantasies she had entertained in Boston, different from the brief infatuation she had felt for a young clerk a few years back. This was deeper, rooted in genuine respect and compatibility and shared values. She saw the way Samuel cared for his land and his animals and his workers. She saw his integrity, his fairness, his quiet generosity. She saw the way he had gently brought her into his life, giving her space to heal while also making it clear that her presence mattered to him. And she saw, in the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, that he was feeling something too, but she did not know what to do with these feelings. She was still in mourning. Her life was still in limbo. And despite the connection growing between them, they had only known each other for a week. One evening, after they had spent the afternoon planting bulbs that would come up in spring, Samuel invited Georgia to go riding with him. "Not a long journey like before," he said. "Just around the property. There is something I want to show you." They saddled up and rode out into the pastures, where cattle grazed peacefully in the long shadows of evening. Samuel led them to a small rise that overlooked the ranch, where the view stretched for miles in every direction. Mountains to the west, plains to the east, the town of Greeley visible as a cluster of buildings in the distance. "This is my favorite spot on the property," Samuel said as they dismounted. "I come here when I need to think, to remember why I work so hard." They sat on the grass, the horses grazing nearby, and watched the sun begin its descent toward the mountains. The sky turned from blue to pink to gold, and the world seemed to hold its breath in the beauty of the moment. "Georgia," Samuel said, his voice serious, "I need to say something, and I need you to listen all the way through before you respond." Georgia's heart began to pound. "All right." Samuel turned to face her, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "I know we have only known each other a short time. I know you are grieving and your life is unsettled, and the last thing you probably need is me complicating things further. But I have to be honest with you. I have to tell you what I am feeling, because if I do not, I will regret it for the rest of my life." He took a deep breath. "I am falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since the moment you stepped onto my porch with your mother's ashes and that photograph, looking so lost and determined at the same time. These past days with you have been the happiest I have had in 8 years. You make me laugh. You make me think. You make me feel alive again in a way I thought I never would. And I know it is too soon. I know you probably think I am crazy, but I had to tell you. I had to let you know that if you wanted to stay, if you wanted to build a life here, you would not be doing it alone. I would be here. We could be together if you wanted that, if you felt anything like what I am feeling." Georgia felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of joy, of relief, of recognition. "Oh, Samuel," she whispered, "I do feel it. I feel exactly the same way. I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it is too fast, too soon, that I am just vulnerable and you are just kind. But it is more than that. So much more. You are more. You make me feel seen and valued and cherished in a way I never have before. When I think about going back to Boston, about leaving you, it feels like tearing out a piece of my heart." Samuel reached for her hands, holding them gently in his larger, work-roughened ones. "Then do not go back. Stay here. Stay with me. I know it is fast. I know it is unconventional, but out here we make our own rules. If it feels right, that is all that matters. And Georgia, this feels right. You feel right." "It does," Georgia agreed, her voice shaking with emotion. "It feels more right than anything in my entire life." "But Samuel, what would people say? We barely know each other, and I am in mourning. It would be scandalous." "I do not care what people say," Samuel said fiercely. "My whole life I have done what I thought was right, not what was expected. If you and I know this is real, that is enough. We can take our time. You can stay here in the guest room and we can court properly. Let people see that this is real and lasting. And when you are ready, when enough time has passed that you feel comfortable with it, we will marry. If that is what you want." "It is what I want," Georgia said, the words coming from the deepest part of her soul. "Samuel, I want to stay. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up every morning and see these mountains. I want to work in that garden and watch it bloom. I want to sit on the porch with you in the evenings and talk about everything and nothing. I want all of it. I want you." Samuel's face broke into a smile so bright, so full of joy, that it transformed him. He looked years younger, almost boyish in his happiness. "Georgia Hartford, you have just made me the happiest man in Colorado." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted, but Georgia did not want to pull back. She wanted this, wanted him. When his lips met hers, soft and gentle and full of promise, she felt like she was coming home. They sat on that hillside as the sun set, holding each other, stealing kisses, making plans. Samuel promised to help her arrange her affairs in Boston, to have her mother's belongings shipped west. Georgia promised to write to her mother's few remaining friends, to let them know she was staying in Colorado, starting a new life. "We will make this work," Samuel said. "Whatever it takes, we will make it work." When they rode back to the ranch that night, the stars were brilliant overhead, and Georgia felt like she was riding into her future, bright and beautiful and full of possibility. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity and growing love. Samuel sent a telegram to a lawyer he knew in Denver, arranging for someone to handle settling Georgia's mother's affairs in Boston. Georgia wrote letters, closing that chapter of her life with gratitude but without regret. She knew her mother would approve, would be happy that Georgia had found love in the place her mother had loved most. Samuel courted her with old-fashioned courtesy, taking her on picnics and teaching her to ride better. They worked in the garden together, planning what it would look like when spring came. He introduced her to the neighboring ranchers, presenting her as his intended. And while there were some raised eyebrows at the speed of their courtship, most people seemed happy for Samuel, glad to see him coming back to life after years of grief. Georgia flourished in her new environment. The open spaces, the clean air, the work of her hands in the earth, all of it suited her in a way city life never had. She helped Mrs. Chen with the household tasks, learning to cook Western style and manage a ranch house. She befriended the ranch hands, learning their names and stories. And every evening, she sat with Samuel on the porch, watching the sunset and falling deeper in love. As autumn turned to winter and the first snows began to fall in the mountains, Samuel asked Georgia to take a ride with him back up to the meadow with the 3 cathedral peaks. They bundled up in heavy coats and made the journey on a clear, cold day when the world seemed to sparkle with frost. Standing in the meadow where Georgia had scattered her mother's ashes, with snow dusting the ground and the 3 peaks rising against a brilliant blue sky, Samuel got down on one knee. "Georgia Hartford, I know I already asked you in my clumsy way to stay with me, to build a life together. But I want to do this properly. I want to ask you here, in this place that brought you to me, this place where your mother's love story began." He pulled out a small box and opened it to reveal a simple but beautiful gold band set with a small diamond. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my love for the rest of our lives?" Georgia felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she dropped to her knees beside him, taking his face in her hands. "Yes, yes, Samuel, I will marry you. I love you so much." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they held each other in that sacred place, sealing their promise with kisses and tears of joy. They were married in January of 1886, in a simple ceremony at the ranch attended by neighbors and friends. Georgia wore a dress she had made herself from ivory silk, her only concession to her mother's memory being the lace veil that had been her mother's. Tucker walked her down the temporary aisle set up in the living room, and Mrs. Chen cried happy tears throughout the service. That night, as they lay together as husband and wife for the first time, Samuel held Georgia close and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me with your heart." "Thank you for trusting me with yours," Georgia whispered back. "Thank you for helping me fulfill my mother's last wish. Thank you for giving me a home." "This is your home now," Samuel said, "for always." The years that followed were rich and full. Georgia threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm, developing a reputation as an expert gardener. She started a small business growing and selling seeds, her carefully cultivated varieties particularly suited to Colorado's challenging climate. The garden that had been Catherine's became a showplace, bursting with flowers from early spring through late fall, and Georgia always maintained a small section specifically in memory of the wife who had come before her. Samuel and Georgia's love deepened with each passing season. They learned each other's habits and quirks, learned how to argue productively and make up sweetly, learned to be partners in the truest sense. They worked side by side, making decisions together about the ranch, supporting each other's dreams and weathering hardships as a team. In the spring of 1887, Georgia discovered she was pregnant. She gave birth that December to a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and dark hair. They named him Jonathan, after Georgia's father, and Samuel held his son with tears of joy streaming down his weathered cheeks. "He is perfect," Samuel said, gazing down at the tiny bundle. "You are perfect. Thank you, Georgia. Thank you for this gift." 2 years later, a daughter arrived, a red-faced, loud-voiced little girl they named Catherine, and Samuel said his heart was complete. But Georgia laughed and said they were not done yet. And sure enough, another son came in 1892, whom they named after Samuel's father, William. The ranch prospered under Samuel and Georgia's joint management. They expanded the cattle operation, added sheep, and Georgia's seed business grew into a significant secondary income stream. They built a proper greenhouse and added onto the house to accommodate their growing family. As the years passed and their children grew, Georgia often thought about the journey that had brought her to this life. The grief of losing her mother had never fully disappeared, but it had transformed into something gentler, a bittersweet appreciation for the time they had shared and the values her mother had instilled in her. She visited the meadow with the 3 cathedral peaks at least once a year, sometimes alone, sometimes with Samuel, sometimes with the children. She would stand in that beautiful place and silently thank her mother for the gift of that last wish, for sending her on the journey that had led her to Samuel, to love, to this full and beautiful life. One evening in the summer of 1902, when Jonathan was 14, Catherine was 12, and William was 10, the family sat on the porch watching the sunset. The children were arguing good-naturedly about something, and Samuel had his arm around Georgia's shoulders, and she looked at this life they had built together and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked, his voice low and intimate in the way it got when it was just for her. "I am thinking about how strange and wonderful life is," Georgia said. "How my mother's death, which was the worst thing that ever happened to me, led me to the best thing that ever happened to me. How grief and joy can be so tangled up together." Samuel kissed her temple. "Your mother's love for your father, her wish to rest where they were happiest, it brought you to me. I think about that often. How love, even after death, can create new love, how it ripples out in ways we cannot predict." "I hope our children find love like ours," Georgia said. "Love that sustains and challenges and comforts all at once." "They will," Samuel said with confidence. "We are teaching them by example what real love looks like. They will recognize it when they find it." As the sun dipped below the mountains and the stars began to appear, the children quieted, and they all sat together in the gathering darkness, a family bound by love and choice and the mysterious workings of fate. Years continued to pass. Jonathan grew into a thoughtful young man who loved the land as much as his father did and took over more and more of the ranch operations. Catherine became a teacher in Greeley, passionate about education and helping children learn. William discovered a talent for working with horses and started a breeding program that became renowned throughout Colorado. Samuel and Georgia grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work, but their love never diminishing. They took joy in their grandchildren, in the continuation of the family they had built. They still worked in the garden together when their joints allowed it, still sat on the porch every evening, still stole kisses when they thought no one was looking. On a warm summer day in 1915, when Georgia was 53 years old and Samuel was 60, they rode together to the meadow with the 3 cathedral peaks. It was harder now, their bodies not as resilient as they once were, but they made the journey anyway because it was important, because this place held the foundation of everything they had built together. They spread a blanket in the grass and lay side by side, holding hands, looking up at the sky and the unchanging peaks. "You ever regret it?" Samuel asked. "Staying here, marrying me so quickly, building this life." Georgia turned her head to look at her husband, at his lined face and silver hair and the blue eyes that still made her heart skip a beat. "Not for one single moment. You are the best decision I ever made, Samuel Bradford. You and this life, it is everything I never knew I wanted." "You are everything I never thought I would have again," Samuel said. "After Catherine died, I thought my chance at love was over, but you proved me wrong. You taught me that the heart can love more than once, differently but just as deeply. You gave me so much, Georgia, so much joy." "We gave it to each other," Georgia corrected. "That is what love does. It multiplies. It creates more than the sum of its parts." They lay there for hours, talking and reminiscing and simply being together. When they finally rode back to the ranch, the sun was setting in shades of orange and purple. And Georgia thought again, as she had thought so many times over the past 30 years, how grateful she was for her mother's last wish, for the journey it had set her on, for the man who had helped her fulfill it and then stayed by her side through everything that followed. Samuel and Georgia lived many more years together, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, their ranch a center of family gatherings and celebrations. They grew old with grace, supporting each other through the aches and pains and losses that come with age. When Samuel died in 1928 at the age of 73, Georgia grieved deeply but not bitterly. They had been granted 43 years together, a lifetime of love and partnership. She held his hand as he passed, and his last words to her were, "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for every day. I will love you beyond this life." Georgia lived another 5 years after Samuel's death, cared for by her children and grandchildren, still tending her garden when she could, still visiting the meadow with the cathedral peaks on the anniversary of the day she had scattered her mother's ashes. And when she died peacefully in her sleep in 1933 at the age of 71, her children honored her final request. They took her ashes, along with a small portion of Samuel's that she had kept, and they made the journey to the meadow. There, with 3 generations of family present, they scattered the ashes of Georgia and Samuel together beneath the 3 cathedral peaks, in the place where it had all begun, where love had first taken root and grown into something beautiful and lasting. And in that meadow, where the spring still bubbled clear and cold, where wildflowers still bloomed in purple and yellow and white, the story came full circle. 2 great loves resting together in the place that had brought them into being, their legacy living on in the family they had created, in the lessons about love and courage and following your heart that they had passed down through the generations. The ranch continued to be run by their descendants. The garden still bloomed every year. And the story of Georgia and Samuel, of how grief had led to love, how a dying mother's last wish had created a family, was told and retold. A reminder that even in our darkest moments, even when we think our story is ending, new chapters can begin in the most unexpected and beautiful ways.